January 1945. Cologne, Germany. The roar of artillery fills the air and the ground shakes as a German Tiger tank rolls forward. Its massive 88mm gun aims directly at the enemy, confident in its power. The crew, battle-hardened and experienced, is certain of another easy victory. Another Sherman to destroy, another routine kill. But this time something unexpected happens. The Tiger fires. The shell rips through the air but misses its target. The Sherman, smaller and seemingly weaker, doesn't retreat. Instead, it remains steady, its crew unfazed. In a fluid motion, the Sherman fires back. The German crew stares in disbelief as their tank erupts into flames. The turret is blown off and smoke billows out. The crew is stunned, unable to react. A second German tank, thinking it can outmaneuver, the Sherman tries to reposition, but it's too late. The Sherman's turret swings around and fires again. The German tank is disabled, instantly immobilized in the middle of the street. There's no cheering, no sense of triumph. Just the quiet hum of the Sherman's engine, its crew moving methodically, ready for whatever comes next. In this moment, the Sherman tank, once underestimated, stands as a symbol of resilience, a force to be reckoned with. The scene fades, leaving behind only the crackling fire and the eerie silence of the battlefield. By early 1945, Germany was teetering on the brink. Its fuel reserves were nearly depleted, and its factories, once churning out powerful machines of war, could no longer keep up with the demand. The Allies had broken through the Siegfried Line, pushing deep into German territory. The once feared Tiger tank, symbol of German military superiority, was now a shadow of its former self. Still, it held a psychological grip on both sides, a relic of Germany's pride, a force the Allies feared even as they closed in. On the other hand, the Americans were relentlessly advancing. Despite taking heavy losses, their momentum never slowed. They had learned the hard way that the Germans still had a few tricks left: tanks like the Tiger and Panther aircraft that could cut through bombers like hot knives, through butter U-boats that lurked beneath the icy waters waiting to destroy Allied convoys. But the Americans also had something the Germans didn't: a vast industrial capacity, an unyielding resolve, and the ability to adapt. The situation was delicate. If the Germans could hold on a little longer, the war could stretch into months, maybe even years. The Allies would suffer more casualties, their forces would be stretched thinner, and there would be more opportunities for the Germans to regroup and negotiate from a position of strength. But if the Americans could break through, if they could turn the tide now, the Germans would be left with no way to recover. The war could end much sooner. This battle was more than just the destruction of a few tanks. It was a turning point. The myth of German invincibility was still very much alive. Even though the Allies had superior numbers and better logistics, the Germans relied on their reputation, their heavy armor, and their firepower. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The Sherman tank, once mocked for its supposed inferiority, was now proving its worth. It wasn't about raw firepower or heavy armor. It was about adaptability, speed, and reliability. The Shermans, in their hundreds, were far more than cannon fodder. Their ability to keep fighting after taking hits, their efficiency in urban warfare, and their constant presence on the battlefield had begun to shift the balance. The Germans, despite their bravado, knew this, but their reliance on heavy armor, on tanks like the Tiger and Panther, was proving to be their downfall. These tanks were powerful, yes, but they were expensive to produce, difficult to maintain, and most importantly, slow to adapt. The Americans, on the other hand, could afford to lose a Sherman or two, replace parts, and keep pushing. The Germans, with their dwindling resources, could not afford to lose a single Tiger. The stakes were clear. For the Americans, it was the chance to end the war sooner and with fewer losses. For the Germans, it was the last opportunity to halt the American advance, to stop the Allies from exploiting their newfound advantage. Every engagement, every tank destroyed, was a reminder that the outcome of the war hinged on a handful of these battles that would decide the future of Europe. And so, as the Sherman and the Tiger clashed in the streets of Cologne, the consequences of this battle were far greater than any single tank's destruction. The fate of the war was being decided not just by the weapons on the ground, but by the industrial and psychological strength of both sides. The Germans, locked in a desperate struggle to maintain their dominance, would soon learn that the very tools they relied on, their heavy tanks, were no longer enough. The Allies, through sheer force of numbers and relentless adaptation, were beginning to tilt the scale in their favor. In the cold streets of Cologne, The German belief in their technological superiority was starting to crack piece by piece, as the Sherman's simple, yet effective, proved to be a far greater threat than anyone had imagined. The myth of German invincibility was beginning to unravel. The German Tiger tank was built to intimidate. Weighing nearly 60 tons and equipped with the formidable 88mm KWK 36 liters, 56 gun, it was the crown jewel of Nazi armored forces. Its thick armor, with up to 100 millimeters of steel, sloping down the front, could withstand the majority of Allied anti-tank rounds at long range. The Tiger's firepower could punch through any Allied tank's armor from over a kilometer away. In the open fields of Eastern Europe, with its wide spaces and clear lines of sight, the Tiger was nearly unstoppable. The Panther, introduced shortly after, was an evolution of the Tiger, designed to combine mobility with firepower. With a 75mm KWK, 42 liters, 70 gun, and sloped armor, it was more versatile than its predecessor. The Panther could easily hit targets at greater distances, and its angled armor was even more effective at deflecting incoming fire. It was lighter than the Tiger, making it faster and more maneuverable, a tank capable of keeping pace with fast-moving infantry and supporting mobile attacks. But even the best German designs had flaws. The Tiger's immense weight made it slow and cumbersome, unable to match the speed and maneuverability of lighter Allied tanks in urban environments. In cities like Cologne, where combat was often fought at close quarters, the Tiger's inability to swiftly turn its turret or move quickly through narrow streets became a major disadvantage. A Tiger could easily overpower a Sherman from a distance, but once it was caught in a bottleneck, it was essentially a sitting duck. Inside the Tiger, the crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader driver, and radio operator, operated in tight quarters, each with defined responsibilities. Despite the tank's raw power, it was a highly demanding machine to operate. The turret's slow traverse rate and limited visibility from the driver's hatch put enormous pressure on the crew, particularly in fast-moving battles. And while the thick armor offered protection, it also made the vehicle extremely vulnerable to breakdowns. Every mechanical issue could end a tank's usefulness in combat, as the Germans had neither the resources nor the supply chains to keep them operational. The Panther, while more mobile than the Tiger, was not without its own set of challenges. Its engine was prone to overheating, especially in the intense conditions of a protracted battle. Its gearbox was notoriously fragile, leading to frequent mechanical failures. The combination of these issues meant that even though the Panther could go toe-to-toe with the Sherman at long range, it couldn't always make it to the battlefield, let alone win the engagement. On the other hand, the Sherman was built for reliability, not raw power. Weighing just 30 tons, the M4 Sherman was a far more mobile tank than the Tiger or Panther, designed to be mass-produced and easily repaired in the field. Its 75mm M3 gun, while not as powerful as the 88mm on the Tiger or the 75mm on the Panther, was still capable of knocking out most German tanks at short to medium range. The Sherman's sloped armor, though thinner than the German tanks, could deflect many types of rounds, and its modular design meant it was easier and faster to repair, an essential feature when faced with heavy combat losses. The key advantage of the Sherman was its ability to keep fighting. When a Tiger or Panther was knocked out, it often remained out of action for good. The Sherman, on the other hand, could be patched up quickly in the field and sent back into combat. The U.S. military's logistics system made it possible to replace and repair tanks at a rate the Germans could never match. Every Sherman lost was just a setback. Every Panther or Tiger lost was a catastrophe. Inside the Sherman, the crew was also smaller, only 4 men. The driver, gunner, loader, and commander each had more space to work than their German counterparts, which made it easier for the crew to operate under stressful conditions. The layout of the Sherman was simple, and the tank was intuitive to operate, even for crews with minimal training. This meant that American tank crews could rotate in and out of combat more easily, reducing the fatigue and stress that wore down German tankers. However, the Sherman's biggest strength was its adaptability. It was a versatile platform capable of carrying a variety of weapons and modifications. The U.S. military quickly adapted the Sherman to different battlefield conditions, including the introduction of the Firefly variant, which mounted a powerful British 17-pounder gun to deal with the heavier German tanks. Other modifications included flamethrowing variants and specialized vehicles for mine clearing and bridge laying. In combat, The Sherman proved its worth not through individual moments of glory, but through the sheer volume of tanks produced and deployed. The U.S. produced over 49,000 Shermans during the war, compared to the 1,347 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers built by Germany. This industrial advantage meant that the Americans could overwhelm the Germans by sheer numbers. The German tanks, while technologically superior in certain aspects, simply couldn't match the Allied ability to sustain a prolonged war of attrition. In urban combat, like in the streets of Cologne, the Sherman's smaller size and greater maneuverability gave it an edge. The Germans relied on the long-range firepower of their tanks, but in tight spaces, the Sherman's ability to quickly adjust and return fire made it a formidable opponent. A Tiger with its massive frame struggled to navigate narrow streets or respond to sudden changes in the battlefield. The mechanical simplicity of the Sherman was a significant advantage. Unlike the German tanks, which often required specialist mechanics to repair, the Sherman could be worked on by most field engineers. A damaged engine or transmission could be replaced in a matter of hours, while the German tanks could be sidelined for days. Additionally, the American tankers were trained to use every advantage their tank offered. They would shoot, relocate, and repeat, applying a system of warfare that turned the Sherman from an underdog into an unstoppable force. The first encounter between a Sherman and a German heavy tank was one of complete surprise for the German crews. The Americans had learned to exploit the German weaknesses in close combat, using their speed and reliability to outmaneuver the Tiger and Panther. The Germans had made the mistake of assuming their tanks were invincible, relying too heavily on their firepower and armor without considering how the battlefield itself was evolving. It wasn't just a single hit or a single tank. It was the entire system that the Americans had built around the Sherman that allowed them to consistently beat the Germans. Each tank in the battle wasn't just a machine, it was a product of a war-winning industrial machine. As the Germans continued to rely on their increasingly fragile tanks, the Americans continued to push forward with a relentless tide of well-equipped, fast-repairable machines. The Sherman tank, with all its flaws, had become the heart of the American war effort. The interior of the German Tiger tank is a cramped, stifling space. The crew is on edge, their nerves taut. The commander, his eyes constantly scanning through the periscope, knows exactly what to expect. They've been through this routine countless times before identifying a target, locking onto it, and firing with devastating precision. The process is mechanical, almost automatic. There is no need for conversation. Every crew member knows their role without speaking. The driver grips the levers tightly, feeling the tank's massive weight as it slowly maneuvers through the streets of Cologne. The gunner hunched over his station focuses on the crosshairs of the gun sight, waiting for the perfect shot. From inside, the Tiger feels like an impenetrable fortress. The thick steel armor blocks out all noise from the outside, leaving only the hum of the engine and the occasional clank of the tracks on cobblestone. But as the tank lurches forward, there's a moment of hesitation, a faint vibration that shudders through the hull. It's almost imperceptible, but it's enough to make the crew shift in their seats. They've been through this before, but the streets of Cologne feel different. The tight corners and narrow alleys create a sense of confinement. The crew feels the weight of their tank's power, but they also feel its limitations. They know that this tank, despite its imposing presence, is not invincible in this urban battlefield. The commander's voice crackles through the intercom. Spot the Sherman. Engage. Full power. The gunner, his hands steady, quickly identifies the target, a Sherman much smaller, but its turret already swiveling to meet them. His finger tenses on the trigger. The shot rings out. Outside, the Sherman tank shakes violently from the impact. The crew inside feels the shock, but they don't have time to react. The gunner already has his sights on the Tiger's gun barrel, and within seconds the Sherman fires back. The explosion rattles through the hull, a thundering force that seems to shake the very foundations of the city. Inside the Sherman, it's a different kind of tension. The cramped compartment is filled with the scent of oil and metal, the sound of the engine humming steadily beneath their feet. The crew moves with practiced precision, each man knowing his role in the heat of battle. The commander watches through the periscope, the view shifting as they maneuver around the corner. The sight of the German Tiger tank fills the screen. Target locked, the gunner announces, his voice calm but focused. The Sherman's gun fires with a resounding boom, but the crew doesn't pause. It's not about victory or glory, it's about survival. The crew inside the Sherman knows that they've already been hit once, and the chance of getting another shot in is slim. The armor of the German tank may be thick, but the Sherman has something the Tiger doesn't: agility. The crew quickly relocates, backing up and trying to find cover. There's no time to celebrate or to feel pride. It's simply another moment in a long series of battles. The Tiger crew watches in disbelief as the Sherman tank doesn't break. The shot should have done it a perfect hit, right in the tank's side. But there's no fire, no smoke. The Sherman's crew is still intact, still moving. The Tiger crew's confidence begins to crumble. What should have been a straightforward kill is now an impossible task. The Tiger, too slow and too heavy for the narrow streets, struggles to turn its turret quickly enough. The tank is trapped. The Sherman moves, finding new angles, constantly shifting, never giving the Tiger a chance to settle in. The gunner in the Sherman does not wait for confirmation. He fires again. The round strikes true. The German tank shudders under the impact. The turret whirls, smoke pours from the tank, and then silence. Inside the Sherman, the commander nods slightly, signaling the crew to move again. No words are spoken, only the steady hum of the engine as they begin to reposition. There is no moment of triumph, no celebration. The battle is still ongoing, and there's always the next threat to face. For the German crew, there is no relief. The commander, who moments ago felt in control of the battlefield, now faces the grim reality: the Sherman has survived. There's no moment of victory here, just the realization that despite their firepower, their invincibility was a myth. They've lost. The gunner in the German tank stares at the broken remains of the Sherman. It should be over. But the Tiger is in a bad position now, too far from the cover, unable to maneuver effectively. The American tank's ability to respond, to survive, and to adapt has left them paralyzed. The Germans, once so sure of their superiority, now realize that the myth of the Tiger tank, once an unquestioned symbol of German power, is no longer a truth. It is a relic of a bygone era. The Sherman moves again, its crew steady the process unbroken. The German Tiger is left in its wake, its crew now scrambling to salvage what little they can of the wreckage. The battle continues, but the Germans are no longer the ones in control. The American crew's focus doesn't waver. Their objective is simple: keep fighting, keep moving. In the end, it's not about the Tiger or the Sherman. It's about staying alive, adapting, and pressing on. And for the first time, the German crew realizes that the war may be slipping away from them. The Sherman, their adversary, is not an underdog. It is a symbol of relentless persistence, and that is something far more dangerous than firepower. By the winter of 1944, the war was no longer about the tactical brilliance of individual commanders or even the skill of tank crews. It was about industrial capability, logistics, and the ability to adapt quickly. The Germans, despite their technological advancements, were faltering in all these areas. Their supply chains were stretched thin, their factories working at half capacity, and their manpower severely depleted. They relied on their superior tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, but these machines, for all their firepower and armor, were becoming a liability. Their sheer complexity, coupled with Germany's dwindling industrial and logistical capabilities, made them increasingly difficult to maintain and replace. In contrast, the United States was capitalizing on its industrial might. By 1944, America had already built more than 4,900 Sherman tanks, far surpassing the total number of German tanks, and significantly outproducing them on every front. The Sherman's design, while not as imposing as the German tanks, was intentionally simple, allowing it to be produced and repaired in vast numbers with minimal specialized labor. For the Americans, this was an advantage they fully understood and exploited: quantity over sheer firepower. While the Germans were still clinging to the myth of the invincible Tiger, the Americans were quickly adapting, refining, and improving their capabilities in the field. This process of adaptation began with the Sherman itself. Its design, often derided for being underpowered and lightly armored, proved to be a strength in the context of large-scale warfare. The Sherman's reliability, mobility, and ease of repair made it the perfect vehicle for the brutal, grinding nature of the war in Western Europe. The U.S. military didn't just stop at mass production. They used the Sherman tank as a platform for experimentation and adaptation. The initial versions of the Sherman, with their 75mm M3 gun, were effective, but by 1944, the Americans realized they needed something more. In response, the 76mm gun was introduced, providing more firepower and greater penetration capabilities. It was a direct response to the growing threat of the Tiger and Panther tanks. But the adaptability didn't stop there. The US also introduced modifications like the Firefly variant, which mounted the British 17-pounder gun. These adaptations were not reserved for tanks alone. The U.S. Army rapidly developed tactics for Sherman crews to deal with the German tanks effectively. The key wasn't always to destroy the German tank directly, but to exploit its weaknesses, particularly its reliance on distance. The Sherman's speed and ability to maneuver in tight spaces allowed American crews to get in close, where the German tank's superior firepower and thick armor were less effective. Meanwhile, the Germans had no such luxury. Their tanks were superb pieces of engineering, but they were also a logistical nightmare. The Panther, for instance, was much faster than the Tiger, but it was prone to mechanical failure. Its gearbox was fragile, and its engine would often overheat after sustained combat. The Germans' efforts to increase production only worsened the situation. They had to make trade-offs, quality over quantity. This limited their ability to replace lost tanks and repair damaged ones on the battlefield. The German military was also hampered by a lack of fuel. By late 1944, the Allies had successfully cut off many of Germany's supply lines, leading to critical shortages. The Tigers and Panthers that were operational in the field had become almost impossible to support. For every tank sent into combat, fewer and fewer were available for the next engagement. The Germans, despite their technical superiority, couldn't keep up with the relentless American industrial production machine. While the Americans could afford to lose a tank or two in every engagement and have them replaced within days, the Germans couldn't afford to lose a single Tiger or Panther, and often, when they did, it meant the end of that particular tank's war. A critical decision that compounded Germany's issues was the lack of focus on logistical doctrine. German military philosophy had long emphasized the technical superiority of their equipment, believing that advanced technology alone could win battles. They had neglected the importance of maintaining a sustained supply of parts, fuel, and manpower, which is a lesson the Americans learned the hard way early in the war. By 1944, the Americans had perfected their logistics network. The Red Ball Express, a massive supply operation, kept the Allies' frontline units consistently equipped and operational, even as they pushed into France and Germany. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowed into the battlefronts in unprecedented quantities, and this made the Sherman tank a durable and ever-present threat. The Germans, however, were unable to match this efficiency. Their tanks required highly specialized mechanics, and the parts needed for repairs were often in short supply. This situation meant that when a German tank was knocked out of action, it was often permanently out of the fight. It wasn't just the loss of the tank itself, but the manpower and resources required to repair it, which further drained Germany's already stretched resources. The contrast in these logistical capabilities was stark. The Americans, with their massive production facilities, could replace tanks and repair vehicles in record time. Factories churned out new Shermans every day, and when a tank was knocked out, it could often be fixed and sent back to the front lines within hours. The Germans, on the other hand, found themselves in a position where every lost Tiger or Panther was a significant blow to their overall combat effectiveness. As the war dragged on, the Germans were forced to rely on their advanced technology, hoping that their superior tanks would be enough to halt the Allied advance. But with fewer operational tanks and no reliable means of repairing or replacing them, their hope quickly faded. The Germans' inability to adapt to the realities of modern warfare was compounded by their inability to maintain the morale of their troops. The myth of the Tiger tank was a powerful one, but as the war went on and the German soldiers saw their tanks knocked out one by one, the psychological weight of those losses began to wear on them. They couldn't afford to lose tanks, and the longer the war dragged on, the more their resources were depleted and the more their morale suffered. The Americans, in contrast, could afford the luxury of learning from their mistakes. They could take losses, analyze what went wrong, and implement changes to adapt. When a Sherman tank was destroyed, it was replaced. When a strategy failed, it was revised. This flexibility and adaptability, combined with the U.S. overwhelming industrial capacity, made the Sherman an unstoppable force. The Germans were bogged down by their reliance on a few powerful tanks, while the Americans had mastered the art of mass production, logistics, and adaptation. The battle was no longer about the technical superiority of individual machines. It was about the ability to replace those machines and adapt tactics quickly. The Germans couldn't keep up, and as their tanks were slowly whittled down, the myth of their invincibility crumbled. The Americans, meanwhile, learned, adapted, and pressed on. And in the end, it wasn't the individual power of the Sherman tank, but the overwhelming tide of American industrial might that proved to be the deciding factor in the war. The myth of the German Tiger tank had been built over years of warfare, a symbol of mechanical perfection and battlefield dominance. It was the epitome of German engineering, heavy, powerful, and virtually invulnerable. The Germans believed that as long as they held onto their Tigers and Panthers, they could control the battlefield, striking fear into the hearts of Allied troops. This psychological weapon was as important as the tank's raw power. It became a symbol of German might, a legend that persisted even as the reality of the war shifted beneath it. But now, in the narrow streets of Cologne, that myth was crumbling. The German tank crews, once so confident in their superiority, could no longer deny what they had witnessed. The Sherman, often ridiculed for its thin armor and smaller armament, was surviving. The German tanks, once the terror of the battlefield, were being destroyed at an alarming rate. The Sherman's adaptability, its ability to take a hit and keep moving, had exposed the limits of the German strategy. The crew inside the Tiger had been trained for battles of attrition, for outgunning and outlasting their enemies. But here, in the urban warfare of Cologne, the rules were different. The Tiger's bulk, its slow turret rotation, and its massive size made it a liability in these confined spaces. The Sherman, with its superior maneuverability, could quickly exploit those weaknesses. The German crews had relied on their technological advantage, the idea that their tanks could absorb punishment and keep fighting. But now the Sherman was doing the same, and it was winning. The first encounter had been a shock. The Tiger, in all its glory, had taken a direct hit, but it had not been destroyed. Yet the second shot from the Sherman hit with precision, causing a catastrophic failure in the Tiger's systems. In that brief moment, the myth of German invincibility began to crack. The Germans had no choice but to confront the uncomfortable truth. Their technological superiority, once seen as a guarantee of victory, was no longer enough. Inside the destroyed Tiger, the crew was silent. They were trapped in their own disbelief. They had watched as their tank, once a fearsome war machine, had been brought down by a tank they had long considered inferior. The realization set in the Sherman had proven itself not just as a survivor, but as a legitimate threat. The psychological blow was just as significant as the physical one. The Germans no longer had the upper hand, not in this battle, and not in the war. For the Americans, this moment was not one of triumph, but of grim recognition. They had known all along that the Sherman was capable, but it was only in this moment, when the Tiger had fallen, that they fully understood the power of numbers and adaptability. The myth of the German tanks had been shattered not by a single heroic shot, but by the relentless, unyielding force of American industry and ingenuity. The shockwave of this realization spread quickly through the German ranks. In subsequent battles, German tank crews began to hesitate. No longer did they have the same confidence in their invincible machines. The idea that the Tiger could stand unchallenged on the battlefield was shattered. The Sherman, once dismissed as a mere nuisance, had proven itself a reliable and deadly adversary. The myth was over, but the psychological collapse didn't stop with the German tank crews. It reached the highest levels of command. Reports from German officers began to admit the obvious: the Americans had adapted faster, learned more efficiently, and now had a tank that could match the Germans on every front. The myth of the Tiger, once the pinnacle of warfare, was now a liability. German officers began to recognize that their tanks, their legendary machines, were becoming more and more difficult to replace. The loss of a Tiger wasn't just the loss of a machine, it was the loss of a symbol that had held the German war effort together. The fearsome reputation of the Tiger no longer held the same power. By the time the Allies pushed into the heart of Germany, the Germans were no longer fighting with the same confidence. The Tigers and Panthers, while still formidable, were becoming increasingly scarce. The Allied forces, buoyed by the knowledge that they could take down these tanks and keep advancing, pressed forward without the same fear that had once paralyzed them. The collapse of the German myth was not just about tanks. It was about the slow, inexorable shift in momentum. The Germans could no longer rely on their technical superiority to win battles. The battle for the future of Europe was no longer about who had the biggest guns or the thickest armor. It was about the ability to keep fighting, to keep producing, and to keep adapting. The Americans had learned this lesson early in the war, and now it was paying off. In the final days of the war, as the Germans retreated and their tanks were destroyed one by one, the myth of the Tiger tank lay in ruins. What had once been a symbol of invincibility was now just a target, an expensive relic that the Germans could no longer afford to lose. The Americans, with their superior numbers and relentless spirit, had turned the tide. The legend of the Tiger had ended not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small defeats, the cumulative effect of industrial might adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of victory. And in the quiet aftermath of the battle, as the smoke cleared and the wreckage of German tanks smoldered in the streets, the truth became undeniable. The Sherman had not only survived, it had triumphed. The myth of the German tank, once thought unbreakable, was finally shattered. In the weeks following the Battle of Cologne, the aftermath was felt throughout the entire German military. The psychological blow of losing their most iconic tanks was immediate and profound. The Tiger and Panther tanks, once symbols of German pride and technological supremacy, had become a burden rather than a strength. German officers began to openly admit what was once unthinkable: their tanks were no longer invincible, and the Allies had found a way to not just survive, but to adapt, overcome, and ultimately win. The German tank crews, already demoralized by the relentless Allied advance, now faced a new reality. No longer could they rely on their reputation or the fear their tanks once inspired. The Sherman, previously seen as a symbol of American inferiority, had become a serious threat. The loss of so many Tigers and Panthers in battles like Cologne, coupled with the overwhelming production capabilities of the Americans, made it clear that Germany's tanks, for all their firepower, could not keep up in a war of attrition. For the Americans, the victory at Cologne was more than just a single engagement won. It was a confirmation of their industrial superiority. They had learned from their mistakes, adapted quickly, and produced in numbers that the Germans simply could not match. The myth of the German tanks had been shattered, but the true victory was in the realization that the war was no longer about individual machines or isolated battles. It was about overwhelming force, the ability to replace and repair tanks, and the unyielding will to press on. The Sherman tank, once considered a stopgap measure, had proven itself, not through a single heroic engagement, but through its relentless presence on the battlefield. It wasn't the heaviest, the most powerful, or the most technologically advanced tank on the field, but it was the one that could keep fighting, keep moving, and keep pushing forward. In the face of all odds, the Sherman became a symbol of American resilience and adaptability, qualities that would define the outcome of the war. But the victory at Cologne wasn't just about the tanks. It was about the broader implications of how the war was fought. The Germans, bound by their reliance on a few high-tech, powerful machines, were increasingly vulnerable to the sheer numbers and adaptability of the Allies. As the war in Europe neared its end, the Allies had learned how to fight with machines, men, and logistics in perfect synchronization. The Germans, meanwhile, had been outpaced by a war of industrial and psychological endurance. This shift in momentum became even more apparent in the weeks after Cologne. The German High Command was forced to confront the reality that their reliance on the Tiger and Panther had become a strategic weakness. The tanks that were supposed to represent the pinnacle of their military power had turned into a symbol of their inability to adapt. The myth of the German tank was not only shattered on the battlefield, but it also collapsed in the minds of the soldiers who once believed in their invincibility. As the Allies pushed forward, capturing cities and crushing German resistance, the tanks that had once struck fear into the hearts of their enemies were now being abandoned or destroyed in rapid succession. The American forces, bolstered by their unwavering industrial capacity and ever-improving tactics, moved into the heart of Germany. The myth of the Tiger was gone, replaced by the undeniable truth: the Allies could not be stopped. Yet, as the war in Europe came to an end, one crucial question remained. What if the Germans had recognized the need for adaptation earlier? What if they had understood that their technological edge could no longer guarantee victory? Could the Allies have ended the war even sooner if the Germans hadn't relied so heavily on a few iconic tanks? This question lingers in the minds of historians and strategists alike. The myth of the Tiger tank, while now reduced to a historical footnote, serves as a cautionary tale of how reliance on technological superiority without the capacity to adapt can lead to a nation's downfall. The collapse of that myth marked not just the end of the German tank dominance, but also the beginning of a new era in modern warfare. one where the ability to adapt the speed of logistics and the overwhelming power of numbers would define the future. As the world moves on, the legacy of the Sherman tank continues to endure. It became a symbol of not just military success, but of the power of industrial and strategic innovation. The U.S. did not win the war simply because of superior tanks or better firepower. They won because they could produce, adapt, and overwhelm the enemy with an unrelenting force. The Sherman was not the star of the show, it was the engine that kept the U.S. war machine running, a testament to the power of persistence over perfection. Next, we turn to the German Panther tank. Once hailed as the perfect medium tank, the Panther's own legacy is marked by its mix of strength and vulnerability. We'll explore what happened when it faced America's cheap Sherman and why, despite its technical brilliance, it too could not change the course of the war.